The encounter. The morning sun had barely lifted above the rooftops when Naomi Carter tied the last button of her faded waitress uniform and adjusted the frayed apron around her waist. At 30 years old, Naomi was already carrying more weight than most people twice her age. Her father, once a proud carpenter with strong hands and a booming laugh, was bedridden with failing lungs, and every day she returned from work to feed him, wash his clothes, and keep his medicine stocked with whatever meager tips she could scrape together. Life had never shown Naomi much mercy, but she had learned to keep her back straight and her smile gentle, even when her bones ached from exhaustion. Riverstone Diner, the place where she worked, was no paradise. It was a bustling restaurant near the richer part of town, full of men in pressed suits and women with diamond earrings who never once looked at her as more than part of the furniture. The owner, Mr. Grayson, a broad man with silver hair and a cruelly calculating smile, paid her minimum wage and barked orders as though she were not human at all, but some machine for carrying plates. Yet Naomi endured it all without complaint because there was no choice. She had a sick father waiting at home, and survival left no room for rebellion. That particular winter evening, the streets outside Riverstone were painted with frost, and the biting air crept in through every crack of the old diner door. Naomi had just finished clearing a table where a wealthy couple had left barely touched portions of steak and potatoes. She looked at the waste and sighed quietly. Food that could have kept a poor family warm for a night was scraped into the trash without a second thought. She knew better than to take any of it for herself, because the owner checked the garbage and counted missing items with the precision of a hawk. Still, her heart winced at the sight of so much wasted comfort. She stacked the plates, wiped down the table, and forced her tired feet back into motion for the next round of customers. By the time the last guest left and the brass bell over the door gave its final chime, it was past midnight. Naomi's shoulders sagged as she began her closing duties. She swept the floors, polished the counters, and carried heavy trays back into the kitchen. The smell of roasted meat still hung in the air, mingling with the acrid scent of cleaning soap. She worked in silence, only the hum of the freezer and the drip of a faucet keeping her company. Outside, the snow had begun to fall in slow flakes, sticking to the windows and dulling the glow of the street lamps. Naomi wrapped her thin sweater tighter around her, her breath fogging in the cold drafts that slipped under the door. As she was rinsing a pile of dishes, a sound reached her ears. So faint she thought at first it was only the wind. It was a rustling, followed by what might have been a stifled cough. Naomi froze, the plate in her hand slick with soap. She tilted her head, listening again. There it was, a soft whimper like a child trying to hide their tears. Her chest tightened. Carefully setting the plate aside, she dried her hands and tiptoed toward the back door. She hesitated, wondering if her imagination was simply playing tricks. But then the sound came again, more distinct this time, a muffled sniffle carried on the wind. With a deep breath, Naomi unlatched the heavy door and pushed it open. The freezing air hit her face like a slap, but what she saw made her forget the cold entirely. Huddled against the brick wall by the dumpsters were two children, thin as shadows, their clothes nothing more than rags that clung to their shivering bodies. The boy, perhaps 11 or 12, had one arm wrapped tightly around the smaller girl who could not have been more than 8. Their eyes, wide with fear, glistened in the dim glow of the alley's single flickering bulb. The boy lifted his chin with a kind of desperate bravery, but his trembling hands gave him away. The girl buried her face in his chest, too weak to even cry loudly. Naomi's throat tightened with emotion. She stepped closer, her voice soft as if speaking too harshly might frighten them away. "Hey there," she whispered. "What are you doing out here in the cold?" The boy's lips parted, but it took him a moment to find the words. "We're sorry, ma'am," he stammered, his teeth chattering so hard the sound was almost louder than his voice. We were just... We're hungry. We haven't eaten since yesterday." His voice cracked, and the girl clutched his sleeve tighter. Naomi's heart broke into pieces at the sight. She glanced back into the kitchen, her mind racing. If Mr. Grayson or one of the cooks saw her, she would be finished. They already whispered about her being too soft, about how her kindness was a weakness. But she couldn't just turn away. These were children trembling and starving in the snow. The thought of closing the door on them was unbearable. Naomi's pulse quickened with a mix of fear and determination. She turned and hurried back inside, her eyes darting around the kitchen like a thief in her own workplace. With practiced hands, she ladled a steaming bowl of chicken soup from the pot that was meant to be discarded, wrapped 2 rolls in a napkin, and poured hot tea into a thermos. Every second felt like stolen time, her ears tuned for the heavy steps of Mr. Grayson. When she returned to the alley, the children were still there, staring at her with disbelief. She crouched down, holding out the food. "Here," she said softly, "eat this. It's warm." For a moment, neither of them moved, as if they thought it might be a trick. Then the boy slowly reached out, took the bowl, and pressed it into his sister's hands. The girl's eyes widened, and she dipped the spoon with trembling fingers, sipping cautiously at first, then faster as warmth spread through her. Tears rolled down her cheeks as she swallowed. The relief etched across her small face. The boy waited patiently until she had taken several spoonfuls before tasting it himself. He closed his eyes as if savoring the richest feast in the world. Naomi felt her own eyes sting with unshed tears. She stayed crouched beside them, her arms wrapped around herself against the cold, watching as they devoured the food. In that moment, she felt something stir deep within her, a fierce protectiveness, a vow that she did not speak aloud but knew to be unshakable. These children were not strangers. They were now part of her story, and she could not let them slip away into the night like forgotten shadows. Just then, the sound of footsteps echoed from inside the diner. Naomi's heart leapt into her throat. She quickly set the thermos beside the boy and whispered urgently, "Stay quiet. Don't move." She darted back inside, pulling the door nearly shut behind her. Mr. Grayson's voice rang from the hallway, sharp and suspicious. "Naomi, what are you doing back here? We close at midnight, not sunrise." She forced a tired smile and picked up a mop. "Just finishing the floors, sir," she replied, her voice steady though her pulse hammered. He narrowed his eyes, then grunted and disappeared into his office. Only when the door slammed shut did Naomi let out the breath she was holding. When she finally returned to the alley, the children were gone, the bowl empty and the thermos missing, carried with them into the night. But Naomi did not feel abandoned. She knew in her bones this was not the last time she would see them. Something unexplainable had tied their fates together that evening, and deep down, she sensed that her quiet act of defiance, the simple offering of food, was the beginning of a story far larger than anything she could yet imagine. The secret bond. The following night, Naomi found herself distracted at every step of her shift. She refilled coffee cups, carried heavy trays across the diner, and plastered the usual polite smile on her face for the customers. But her thoughts drifted again and again to the children she had found in the alley. Their trembling shoulders, the boy's desperate bravery, the girl's tears of relief when the soup warmed her. Those images would not leave her. Even as wealthy patrons left behind untouched desserts and glasses of wine, Naomi was haunted by the memory of 2 children who would have given anything for a crust of bread. When she tried to sleep that morning after finishing her night shift, the blankets felt thin and her stomach churned with unease. She kept wondering, where had they gone? Were they safe? Did they find somewhere warm? Or were they still shivering in some abandoned corner of the city? The answer came a week later. Snow fell heavier that night, layering the streets in silence, and Naomi worked her usual long hours. By the time she closed the diner kitchen, she once again heard faint sounds behind the door. This time the scrape of a shoe on frozen concrete. She opened it cautiously, and there they were. The boy and girl stood together in the dim alley, their cheeks red from the cold, but this time their eyes met hers not with fear but with fragile hope. The boy straightened his back and gave her a small, almost formal nod, as though he were trying to be a man though still only a child. We didn't know if you'd be here," he said quietly. Naomi felt her chest tighten. She knelt, holding out a paper bag she had prepared in advance, stuffed with rolls, roasted chicken scraps, and even an apple she had bought with her own money. "I thought you might come back," she admitted softly. "I saved this for you." The girl's eyes lit up and she clutched the bag as if it were treasure. For the first time, Naomi saw her smile, thin, weary, but radiant with innocence. They ate in silence at first, and when the boy finally spoke, his words were halting. "My name's Elijah," he said, his voice low but steady. "And this is my sister Lila." Naomi repeated their names slowly, committing them to memory. Elijah and Lila. They were no longer nameless children lost to the night. They had identities, histories, and now a fragile connection to her. Naomi felt something shift inside her at that moment. She was no longer just feeding hungry strangers. She was protecting Elijah and Lila, even if she didn't yet know what that would cost. Night after night, the bond grew stronger. Naomi began to set aside portions of food intentionally. She hid rolls beneath napkins and tucked away bowls of soup before the cooks scraped them into the trash. After her shift, she would sneak the food outside to the alley, where Elijah and Lila always waited. Sometimes they were silent, simply eating with the focus of children who could not afford to waste a single crumb. Other times Elijah would talk, telling her about the places they tried to sleep, an abandoned bus station, the drafty attic of a half-ruined building. He spoke with a strange maturity, as if protecting Lila forced him to grow up far too soon. Lila, on the other hand, spoke little, but she drew. She carried scraps of paper and a stub of pencil, and while Elijah talked, she sketched. Naomi once looked over her shoulder and saw a drawing of the diner, complete with the glowing sign and Naomi herself standing in the doorway. The sketch was clumsy but filled with feeling. When Naomi saw it, her throat tightened with emotion. As weeks passed, Naomi began to look forward to these secret meetings more than anything else in her day. The exhaustion of serving arrogant customers, the cruel glares of her boss, even the loneliness of her small apartment. None of it mattered when she opened the back door and saw Elijah and Lila's faces brighten. She told herself she was only giving them food, but deep down, she knew she was giving them more. Hope, affection, a fragile sense of stability in a world that had denied them everything. They in turn gave her something she hadn't realized she had lost: purpose. But secrets have a way of unraveling. Naomi noticed whispers among the other waitresses when food began disappearing more often than usual. A missing roll here, a bowl of soup there. It was only scraps, but Riverstone's staff were trained to notice everything. One evening, as Naomi carried a plate back to the kitchen, she caught two of the cooks glancing at her suspiciously. She lowered her gaze and hurried on. But dread coiled in her stomach. If Mr. Grayson discovered what she was doing, she knew the consequences would be merciless. He did not tolerate kindness. He saw it as weakness, as a threat to his control. Yet Naomi could not stop. Every night she continued to feed Elijah and Lila, even as the risk grew sharper. One evening, after the children had finished their meal, Elijah looked at her with unusual seriousness. "Why are you helping us?" he asked. "You don't even know us. If someone sees you, you'll be in trouble. Why would you do that for us?" Naomi hesitated, unsure how to put into words what she felt. Finally, she said softly, "Because no one else will, and because someone should. You're just children. You deserve more than cold streets and empty stomachs. If I can do even a little to make that better, then I will." Elijah studied her for a long moment and then nodded with the gravity of someone far older than his years. "We won't forget this," he said quietly. Lila squeezed Naomi's hand, her eyes wide and shining in the darkness. Naomi didn't know then how prophetic those words would be. All she knew was that the secret she had built in that back alley was both the most dangerous and the most precious part of her life. It gave her courage even as it carried the risk of ruin, and that risk would soon catch up to her. For one night, after Naomi handed Elijah a bag of food and whispered her usual goodnight, she turned and froze in the doorway. There, standing just inside the kitchen with arms crossed and eyes hard as stone, was Mr. Grayson. His face was a mask of anger and disdain, and Naomi's heart dropped into her stomach. The game of secrecy was over. The silence in the kitchen stretched like a noose. Naomi froze with the empty bowl in her hand, the night air still clinging to her skin. Mr. Grayson stood a few feet away, his large frame filling the narrow doorway, his expression carved from stone. His silver hair gleamed under the harsh fluorescent lights, but his eyes were darker than Naomi had ever seen. For years she had endured his scolding remarks, his dismissive tone, his habit of treating her like she was invisible. Yet this was different. This was not annoyance or disapproval. This was fury, sharpened into something personal. "So this is where our food has been disappearing," he said finally, his voice calm but dripping with venom. "I should have known." He stepped closer, his polished shoes clicking against the tile floor. Naomi's hands shook, but she forced herself to set the bowl down gently, her voice trembling as she spoke. "They're just children, sir. They're hungry. You couldn't what?" he snapped, cutting her off. His voice rose, echoing against the stainless steel walls. "You couldn't control your bleeding heart? You couldn't stop yourself from stealing from the very hand that feeds you? Do you realize what you've done, Naomi? This is a business, not a charity. My customers pay for quality, Not so their scraps can be handed out to beggars behind my back. His words struck like blows, each one stripping away a layer of Naomi's dignity. She lowered her head, but she did not apologize. Instead, she whispered, "I didn't steal, sir. I gave away what was going to be thrown out. Food that would have rotted in the trash. I couldn't leave them to starve." Her defiance only fueled his rage. Grayson's lips curled into a cruel smile. "And who are you to decide that, A waitress, nothing more. You think your soft heart makes you noble? It makes you a liability." He turned, his voice loud enough to summon the rest of the staff. "Everyone come here now." Within moments, waitresses, cooks, and dishwashers gathered in the kitchen doorway, their faces a mixture of confusion and unease. Grayson pointed at Naomi with a dramatic flourish, his voice booming. "This woman, this so-called employee, has been stealing from Riverstone. She's been feeding thieves and vagrants behind our backs. I will not tolerate such behavior under my roof." Naomi felt heat rise in her cheeks, humiliation burning through her like fire. She wanted to explain, to tell them about Elijah and Lila, about the way their thin hands trembled when they held a spoon, about the way their eyes lit up at the taste of warm food, but her voice caught in her throat. She saw the skeptical looks in the eyes of her coworkers, the way they shifted uncomfortably but said nothing. No one would defend her. No one dared to challenge Mr. Grayson's word. "You're fired," he declared, his tone final and merciless. "Effective immediately. Get out of my diner and never come back. I'll make sure every restaurant owner in this city knows exactly what kind of woman you are." His words struck harder than any slap. Naomi staggered back, clutching her apron as if it could shield her. She opened her mouth to plead, but the look in his eyes silenced her. With trembling fingers, she untied the apron and laid it on the counter. Then, with every ounce of strength she had left, she lifted her chin and walked out the door, past the wide-eyed stares of her coworkers, past the whispers that clung to her like smoke, and into the freezing night. Outside, the snow fell heavier, blanketing the world in silence. Elijah and Lila were waiting in the shadows of the alley, their faces pale with fear. When they saw her empty hands and the tears she tried to hide, Elijah stepped forward, his voice small. Did he find out?" Naomi nodded, forcing a shaky smile. "Don't worry about me," she whispered, crouching to pull them both into her arms. "It's not your fault. None of this is your fault." But inside, she felt her world collapsing. Without her job, how would she pay for her father's medicine? How would she keep the small apartment where the three of them often shared meals? Grayson's threat to ruin her reputation echoed in her mind like a curse. The following days proved him true. Naomi dressed in her best clothes, though they were nothing more than worn blouses and skirts, and went door to door, applying at every restaurant and cafe she could find. At first, managers looked at her kindly, promising to consider her. But then something changed. A phone call would be made or a name would be whispered, and suddenly their tone grew cold. "I'm sorry, Miss Carter, but we can't hire someone with a history of dishonesty," one manager said bluntly, sliding her application back across the counter. Another, more sympathetic, leaned closer and whispered, "Mr. Grayson has influence in this city. He says you stole from him. No one wants that kind of trouble." By the end of the week, Naomi's savings were nearly gone. Her father's medicine ran short, and she had to choose between buying it or buying food. Still, each night she found a way to bring Elijah and Lila something to eat, even if it was only a loaf of bread or a small bag of rice. She took odd jobs where she could, handing out flyers in the bitter cold, scrubbing cars until her hands cracked from the icy water, cleaning empty offices long past midnight. She returned home exhausted, her feet blistered and her back aching, but the thought of the children kept her moving. Their faces reminded her why she couldn't give up. Sometimes, late at night, Naomi would sit beside her father's bed, his breathing shallow and labored, and she would whisper her fears into the darkness. "I don't know how much longer I can do this," she confessed, tears rolling silently down her cheeks. But then she would remember the way Lila smiled when she handed her a warm meal, or the way Elijah stood protectively by his sister's side, and she knew she had to keep going. She had made a silent promise that night in the alley, and breaking it was not an option. Meanwhile, Grayson thrived. Naomi saw his face in the newspaper one morning, the headline proclaiming him Businessman of the Year. There he stood in a crisp suit, shaking hands with city officials, smiling for cameras as though he were a pillar of generosity. Naomi stared at the picture until her vision blurred with tears. How could the world be so cruelly blind? How could a man who crushed others beneath his heel be celebrated, while she, who had only tried to help 2 starving children, was left to scrape crumbs from the floor of society? But even as bitterness gnawed at her, Naomi refused to let it consume her. Each day she rose again. Each day she found a way to endure. She carried with her the memory of Elijah's solemn promise. "We won't forget this." She did not yet know how those words would one day transform her life, but she clung to them like a fragile thread of hope. And so Naomi fell, not just from her job, but from the fragile security she had built. She became invisible in the eyes of the world, dismissed as a thief and a failure. Yet in the shadows, in the quiet moments shared with 2 children who had nothing but gratitude in their hearts, she found a strength she never knew she possessed. A strength that would carry her through the darkest years to come. The journey forward, the years that followed, became a blur of sacrifice and quiet resilience. Naomi Carter, once a simple waitress with little more than fragile hope, found herself transformed into something far stronger, though she never recognized it within herself. Every day began before dawn, when she would lace her worn shoes and step into the icy streets to distribute flyers for a corner grocery store. By mid-morning, she was at the car wash, her hands raw from scrubbing away grease and road salt, her skin cracked from the chemicals in the water. At night, when the city lights flickered on and the streets emptied of busy pedestrians, she slipped into tall office buildings, vacuuming floors, polishing desks, and wiping down windows until her reflection stared back at her with tired eyes. Then she would return home, her body aching, her clothes damp with sweat, only to sit at her father's bedside and feed him spoonfuls of soup before collapsing into a restless sleep. Yet no matter how heavy her burdens grew, Naomi never arrived at the back alley empty-handed. Elijah and Lila were always waiting, their faces lighting up when she appeared. Sometimes it was a hot meal she managed to cook from scraps, sometimes only a loaf of bread or a few apples bought with her last coins. But to the children, every gift felt like a miracle. They never complained, never asked for more. Elijah would thank her solemnly, bowing his head in a way that reminded her of a grown man, while Lila would press her drawings into Naomi's hand, sketches of angels, houses, and smiling faces, visions of a world she longed for but had never known. Naomi kept every drawing, storing them in a box beneath her bed, as if collecting fragments of a future she prayed the children might one day claim. As the seasons turned, the children grew. Elijah's frame lengthened, his shoulders straightening, his eyes sharpening with intelligence. He devoured every book Naomi managed to find at thrift stores or libraries, teaching himself math, history, and science. He asked questions endlessly, and Naomi, though she often didn't have the answers, encouraged him to keep searching, to never stop learning. Lila blossomed into a gentle, thoughtful girl with a gift that astonished Naomi more each day. Her drawings grew more intricate, her pencil strokes alive with emotion. She captured moments Naomi didn't even realize she had given, the way she smiled at them in the cold, the way her hands held out food with tenderness, the way Elijah's eyes softened when he looked at his sister. It was as if Lila saw truths hidden beneath the surface and poured them onto paper. Despite their growth, hardship never loosened its grip. There were nights Naomi returned home with bleeding hands, barely able to lift a spoon, but still she forced herself to prepare food. There were mornings she faced eviction notices tacked onto her door, her rent unpaid because her father's medicine had to come first. There were days when cruel whispers followed her in the marketplace, rumors planted years ago by Grayson still poisoning her reputation. Yet through it all, Naomi pressed forward. She told herself that so long as Elijah and Lila had a chance, her suffering was not in vain. One spring afternoon, Elijah came running to her, breathless with excitement. "Naomi, I got in. They accepted me." He thrust a crumpled letter into her hands, his smile wide and trembling. It was from a local community school, offering him a scholarship for his brilliance in mathematics. Naomi's eyes blurred with tears as she read the words over and over. She had seen the spark in him for years, but now someone else had recognized it too. Elijah would no longer be confined to abandoned buildings and second-hand books. He had been given a doorway into a different future. Lila's turn came a year later, when one of her drawings, submitted by a teacher who had noticed her talent, was chosen to be displayed at a city gallery. Naomi remembered the night they traveled together to see it. Lila stood in awe before her framed sketch of a woman handing bread to 2 children, the figure surrounded by light. Strangers walked past and paused to admire it, murmuring words of praise. Lila turned to Naomi, her eyes shimmering with tears. "It's you," she whispered. "You're the light in all my drawings. You're the reason I can imagine something better." Naomi hugged her tightly, her heart swelling with both pride and sorrow. She had given up so much, yet in that moment she realized she had given them the most important gift, a chance to dream. Still, Naomi's own life remained a grind of endless labor and sacrifice. Her father eventually passed away, his frail hand slipping from hers one quiet night, leaving her with an empty home and a silence that cut deep. She buried him with dignity, though only a few neighbors attended, and afterward she stood alone at his grave, whispering, "I'll keep going. I'll protect them for both of us." She returned to her routine, carrying her grief silently, never letting it show in front of Elijah and Lila. They had already lost enough. She refused to let them carry her sorrow as well. Years rolled by, marked by milestones that seemed small to the world but monumental to Naomi. Elijah graduated with honors, giving a speech where he spoke not of his own brilliance but of the woman who had believed in him when no one else had. Lila won competitions, her art praised for its raw humanity and emotional depth. Yet every time she was interviewed, she mentioned the woman who had fed her when she was hungry and told her she mattered. Naomi often stood at the edge of crowds, clapping with quiet pride, never stepping into the spotlight. She didn't want recognition. She only wanted to see them soar. By the time Naomi reached her mid-40s, her hair threaded with gray and her body worn from decades of toil, Elijah and Lila had grown into young adults with promising futures. The city buzzed with their names. Elijah Carter, the mathematics prodigy entering the world of technology and innovation. Lila Carter, the artist whose paintings stirred emotions in every gallery they graced. Yet in Naomi's small neighborhood, she was still seen as the woman who had once been fired in disgrace, the woman who scraped by cleaning offices and washing cars. Her neighbors pitied her, sometimes even mocked her, never knowing that the seeds she had sown were about to bloom into something extraordinary. On one particularly cold morning, Naomi sat in her modest kitchen, sipping weak tea and staring out the window at the gray sky. Her hands were rough, her back stiff, and her spirit heavy with years of struggle. She wondered, not for the first time, if her life had truly mattered. She had given everything she had, but in the quiet moments when no one was watching, doubt crept in like a shadow. Did her sacrifices mean anything in a world that still dismissed her? Did Elijah and Lila truly understand how much of herself she had poured into them? She didn't know then that an answer was already on its way. That far beyond the city skyline, a plan was unfolding, a reunion being prepared, and soon, the world that had scorned Naomi would see her in a light brighter than she could have ever imagined. For in the distance, though she could not yet hear it, the blades of a helicopter were beginning to turn. The return. The morning began like any other in Naomi Carter's life, quiet and unremarkable, the gray sky pressing low over her modest home. She stood at the kitchen sink rinsing a chipped cup, her movements slow from years of strain. The kettle on the stove whistled faintly, the only sound breaking the silence. Naomi's face, once smooth and youthful, carried the lines of hardship, etched into her skin by endless nights of labor, by grief carried alone, by the weight of a lifetime spent giving more than she ever received. Her hair, streaked with gray, was tied back in a simple bun. She wore the same faded sweater she had mended more times than she could count. For her, this was life, modest, weary, yet endured with quiet strength. Then, without warning, the world shifted. At first, it was a faint vibration beneath the floor, so subtle Naomi thought she had imagined it. The teacup rattled lightly against the counter. She frowned, turning toward the window. That was when the sound reached her. Low at first, then swelling, a steady thrum that grew louder with each second until it filled the air like a heartbeat of thunder. The noise shook the panes of glass and sent neighbors spilling out of their houses, craning their necks in confusion. Naomi's heart began to race. She set the cup down carefully, her hands trembling, and moved to the window. Her breath caught in her throat. Descending from the clouds, its dark frame slicing through the gray morning sky, was a helicopter, sleek, powerful, and impossibly out of place in her quiet neighborhood. Its blades churned the air, whipping snow and leaves into a frenzy as it hovered above her front yard. The roar was deafening, a sound that seemed to tear apart the ordinary fabric of her life. Naomi staggered back from the window, her pulse hammering. She had never seen a helicopter land in this part of town. People like her were invisible to the world of such machines. What could it possibly want here? At her small house with its peeling paint and sagging porch, she stood frozen as the helicopter descended, its landing skids pressing into her front yard, flattening the brittle grass. Neighbors gathered at the edges of their driveways, whispering among themselves, eyes wide with disbelief. Children pointed, dogs barked, men shielded their eyes against the wind. Naomi, her heart in her throat, wiped her hands nervously on her sweater. She felt both fear and an inexplicable anticipation, as if some long-forgotten promise was finally echoing back to her. The helicopter door swung open. Out stepped a man, tall and commanding in a tailored suit, his shoulders broad, his posture radiating confidence. His face was sharp, distinguished yet softened by an unmistakable gentleness in his eyes. Beside him came a woman, poised with grace, her long coat fluttering in the rotor's wind, her steps measured and elegant. She carried herself like someone who had walked through worlds Naomi could never imagine. Yet her eyes shone with a warmth that pierced through the spectacle. The two figures moved with purpose, heading straight toward Naomi's front door. Her pulse raced faster with every step they took, and something stirred deep within her. There was a familiarity in the way the man tilted his head, in the way the woman's eyes shimmered with unspoken emotion. Naomi's breath hitched. Her hands clutched the edge of the counter as though steadying herself against the impossible. A knock resounded against her door, firm, deliberate, echoing through the silence after the helicopter's roar. Naomi's legs felt weak, but she forced herself to move, drying her trembling hands on her sweater as she walked. Her heart beat so loudly she thought the visitors must surely hear it. Slowly, carefully, she reached for the handle and opened the door. For a moment, time seemed to stop. The three of them stood in silence, framed in the doorway. The man spoke first, his voice low but steady, carrying the weight of years. "Miss Carter," he said, his tone filled with reverence, "do you remember us?" Naomi stared, her eyes widening as recognition dawned like the rising sun. The lines of his face were older, stronger, but behind them she saw the boy who had once stood in the cold alley, shielding his sister with trembling arms. And the woman, her eyes carried the same glow Naomi had once seen in the girl who clutched her hand and sketched dreams onto scraps of paper. Naomi's lips parted, but no sound came at first. Then, trembling, her voice broke free. "Elijah? Lila?" The name slipped into the air, and at once the years melted away. The man and woman stepped forward, their faces breaking into smiles as tears glistened in their eyes. "It's us," Elijah whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "We never forgot. We never could." Naomi's knees nearly gave way, and she covered her mouth with both hands, tears spilling freely down her cheeks. Then she reached for them, pulling them into her arms, her body shaking as she held them close. For years she had wondered if her sacrifices mattered, if her quiet acts of love had simply vanished into the world's indifference. Now here they stood, grown strong, radiant with success, and they were hers, as surely as if she had raised them from her own blood. The neighbors watched in stunned silence as Elijah and Lila guided Naomi gently back into her house. They sat her down at the small table where she had eaten countless humble meals, and for the first time in decades the air was filled not with sorrow or weariness, but with joy that threatened to overflow. Elijah took her hand, his voice steady though his eyes brimmed with tears. "Naomi, we came back because we owe everything to you. You gave us food when we were starving, warmth when we were cold, love when the world gave us none. You believed in us when no one else would, and now it's time we give back." Lila opened a leather portfolio and laid out documents and photographs across the table. "We wanted you to see what your kindness created. Elijah runs a company now, a company that builds technology to help communities in need. And me, my art is displayed in galleries around the world, but none of this would have been possible without you. Every achievement, every dream we reached, it all began with your hands, holding out food on those winter nights." Naomi's tears flowed freely, her chest aching with the flood of emotions. "I only gave you food," she whispered, her voice shaking. Elijah squeezed her hand tighter. "No, Naomi, you gave us life, and now we want to give you the life you deserve." He stood, gesturing toward the helicopter outside. "Come with us. We've bought you a new home, a place where you'll never have to worry about rent or medicine again." We've set up a foundation in your name, a center for children without families, so no child will ever have to shiver hungry in the dark the way we once did. Your name, Naomi Carter, will stand for hope. Lila leaned in, her voice soft but unwavering. The world will finally know who you are. They'll know that one woman's kindness can change the course of lives. Naomi pressed her hands to her face, overcome. She could barely breathe under the weight of such love, such gratitude. For years she had carried her burdens in silence, doubting if her life meant anything at all. And now, in this moment, she realized that her sacrifices had not only mattered. They had transformed the world through the lives of two children who had once looked to her as their only light. The neighbors, still gathered outside, gasped as Naomi stepped onto her porch flanked by Elijah and Lila. The once-forgotten waitress was no longer a figure of pity but of honor, celebrated by the very community that had once scorned her. The helicopter waited, its blade still, a symbol of the future awaiting her. Naomi turned to Elijah and Lila, her voice trembling but clear. I gave you food and you gave me back the world. As they embraced once more, the crowd looked on in awe. And so the story of Naomi Carter, the woman who fed two orphans in secret, who endured humiliation and hardship for the sake of love, was no longer a hidden tale. It was a beacon, a living testament that even the smallest act of kindness could echo across generations and return in ways more powerful and beautiful than anyone could imagine. And above them, the helicopter lifted again, carrying Naomi into a future she never dared to dream of, a future built from compassion, sacrifice, and the unbreakable bond of love.